Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, good evening, depending on what part of the world you're joining us from. Very glad to have you again, and thank you for giving up part of your Friday. Friday is supposed to be a great day to get ready for the weekend. In fact, I've done some work in Australia, as you know, and in North America, we often say TGIF, thank God it's Friday. In Australia, they have a different way of saying it. They say Happy Poets Day. Poets Day. Piss off early, tomorrow's Saturday. So there you go. But you folks haven't pissed off early. You've come to learn about economics in our class today. So thank you for joining us, for your interest and your energy in the course. Now, some of the news that came out over the Thanksgiving weekend, Lisa, greatly interesting. They announced the winner of the annual Nobel Prize in Economics. And this year they selected a Canadian labor economist. Gosh, do you know any Canadian labor economists? Oh, well, thank you. I'm deeply honored. I'd like to thank the Academy. I'd like to thank my parents. Oh, wait, it wasn't this Canadian labor economist. Rats. Okay, it was another Canadian labor economist. So let me just take a moment and introduce the guy who won the Nobel Prize in Economics this year. First of all, interestingly enough, the Nobel Prize in Economics is not actually a Nobel Prize. It's not one of the formal Nobel Prizes that are offered in other disciplines. It's a Nobel-like prize, or sometimes called a fake Nobel Prize. And it's awarded by a committee from the Swedish Central Bank, the Central Bank of Sweden. We're going to study central banks in a later session of our course. And the Central Bank in Sweden has a committee that chooses somebody, or often more than one person, who've made a huge contribution to economics around the world. And lo and behold, this year it was this fellow shared the prize. His name is David Card. And he was born in Guelph, and he's Canadian by birth. He has lived and worked in America for most of his adult life. I think actually all of his work has been in America. He did his graduate studies there and then started working in America. So I think of him as kind of the economics equivalent of Shania Twain, as in a Canadian who only got famous when they went to America. Or perhaps we could say the same thing about Justin Bieber. No, we'll let the Americans keep Justin Bieber. Anyways, David Card's Canadian from Southwest Ontario. There's something in the water in Southwest Ontario that grows great economists. John Kenneth Galbraith, another famous Canadian free-thinking economist, was born near there. He also became famous when he went to America and served as an economic advisor to John F. Kennedy. Anyway, David Card, a very interesting guy. I've met him, and he has done great work, pioneering work over the years on the impacts of minimum wages. And I just thought this was so interesting because this is what we studied last week in our class. I'm going to put up this graph that we looked at last week. This is the conventional neoclassical or free market depiction of how the labor market works. And in this conventional depiction, minimum wages inevitably produce unemployment. And this has been the kind of standard knee-jerk response of conventional economists to the minimum wage for decades. And how this picture works, I won't spend too much time on it, but you have a labor demand function, the downward sloping line, which indicates that employers will hire less people if their wage is higher, and they'll hire more people if the wage is lower. Because like anything else, if it's cheaper, you'll buy more of it. Then there's a labor supply function, which slopes upward. And the idea being there, people need an incentive to work, and so they will work more if the wage is higher. And those two lines cross at the point in the middle, which is economic nirvana, or whatever else you want to call it. The point of economic ecstasy, where supply equals demand. Well, guess what? If supply equals demand, then every worker who wants to work has a job and there's no unemployment. Now, the labor market has never functioned this way. As we discussed before, there's only one time in Canada's whole history where we had full employment, and that was in World War II, under the guise of economic planning, not free markets. But the implication of this theory is if government gets in the way of the free market and tries to impose a minimum wage, so you see on the left side, there's a level of wages called W-min, a minimum wage that's higher than this mythical market clearing wage at the ecstasy spot, then labor demand will fall because workers are too expensive, and labor supply will rise to undue levels because people are drawn in by the higher wage, and as a result, you get unemployment. That's the conventional story. David Card did some fascinating research using natural experiments to prove that this is not what happens. One of his first studies was to look at what happened in the state of New Jersey when they raised the minimum wage there, and he constructed a very careful data set composed of fast food restaurants in the New Jersey part that's next to Pennsylvania, because just across the line in Pennsylvania, they didn't increase the state minimum wage. And so he checked to see, did in fact this conventional story make sense? And in fact, it wasn't. There was no impact on employment in the New Jersey case. And then he went through to theorize many of the different reasons why that might have been the case, including the fact that higher minimum wage means more labor force participation. It's easier for restaurants and other employers to recruit and retain staff. You get higher productivity effects from it. And also, he showed there's in certain circumstances where a higher minimum wage can increase employment, let alone not create unemployment. It can actually increase employment for various reasons. One of which is that if you have very large employers like Amazon or Walmart that have a kind of a power, monopoly power, or in this case, it's called monopsony. Monopsony is when you're the only buyer in a market rather than the only seller. That's a monopoly. Monopsony is you're the only buyer. You can keep wages artificially low by suppressing how much you hire. And if the minimum wage pushes the wage up anyways, then employers stop doing that, and you actually get more work. So great pioneering work, and wonderful that a free-thinking guy and a Canadian got that Nobel Prize. I've just been in a good mood all week because of that. And I will refer you to some work that I've done on minimum wages and the impact on jobs, right up David Card's alley. Not the same methodology, but this is I've done a lot on the minimum wage over the years, but this is probably the most comprehensive report with my co-author, Jordan Brennan. It was published by the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, and it looked at historical data going back to the 1980s in Canada to see if you could trace through an impact of higher minimum wages on employment. And consistent with David Card's Nobel Prize winning thesis, there was no visible impact. In fact, if anything, there was a slight positive impact of higher minimum wages on employment. That didn't change the approach of some of our tight-fisted politicians. In fact, just a week before David Card got the Nobel Prize for his work, the Premier in Ontario, Doug Ford, increased the minimum wage by all of 10 cents. $14.25 an hour to $14.35 an hour. Gosh, people, don't go and spend it all in one place. And that was obviously an evidence that David Card may have convinced the economics profession, but now we've got to convince the politicians. Anyways, that was just a bit of a sidebar on the news of the week, the Nobel Prize update. One other thing before I jump in today's lecture, as Lisa mentioned, the website that we have that has all of the course notes. And we've had a couple of inquiries about getting the course notes in different formats. So I'm just going to show you how to get to those course notes for those that haven't found it yet. This is the website for our Center for Future Work, and it's just centerforfuturework.ca. Easy peasy. And then on the main landing page, you'll see there's a tab there that you click called Online Learning. If you click that tab, then you pull down this drop-down menu, and it's the item at the bottom, Economics for Everyone, How to Cut Through the Jargon. Click on that, and that takes you to the page that we have for all the materials for this course. And there's the full URL for this page, but you should be able to navigate it just through Center for Future Work. And then when you get there, you'll see this. You'll see that we've posted the course outline. And then for each session, we're going to have two formats. One is in a handout format where the slides are small and there's a little bit of room to write beside it for those who like to take notes. The other is in a full slide format where it's perhaps easier to read if you're like me. And I will endeavor to post both formats at least a day in advance of the future session. So, and at the end of it, that'll be a good resource for you if you like to either revisit something we've done or print out hard copies to keep, et cetera, et cetera. And then, of course, we are referring to the recommended textbook, not compulsory, Economics for Everyone, which many of you already have. Okay, enough of the preliminaries. Let's get into today's topic. We're going to talk about owners, bosses, and companies. We have been discussing the makeup of the capitalist economy that we live in, and the fact that there are fundamental differences between different groups of people within our society based on the structural role that they play in the economy. And last week we talked about work and workers and the working class. And this week, we're going to talk about, if you like, the capitalist class or the owning class, or the way that I like to call it, major owners and top managers of private companies. Because one of the defining features of capitalism is most production, not all, but most, about 85% in Canada's case, is undertaken by private businesses that are doing it in hopes of generating a profit for their owners. So the topics that we'll cover today, we'll ask what is capital anyway, how are companies organized, how are they owned, how they behave, and a little bit about the logic of profit that drives their activities, sometimes in beneficial ways, sometimes in less beneficial or useless or actually harmful ways. And then we'll have a little bit of discussion about how the business class is performing in terms of the fundamental job that they're supposed to do, which is invest capital and lead economic growth. There are some of the terms that we'll cover in today's session. And as always, these terms are defined in that online glossary that we've talked about before that is available at the Economics for Everyone website. Actually, just saying that out loud, you know what I should do? I should take that glossary and also post it on the Later Life Learning page that I've just shown you. I will do that. I'll do that this coming week. And so you'll see the course outline, then you'll see glossary, and then you'll see the notes from each session in both of those formats. Hey, that's called learning by doing. That's called constant improvement. That's called innovation. We've just innovated our page as we go. So great stuff. You've heard this from me several times, and you're going to hear it from me several more times before this class is over. Because this framework of thinking about the economy as work, the four-letter word, when we get out of bed and use our brains and brawn to produce goods and services that we need to survive and thrive. And we do so always using nature. We need nature and the place that we live and work, the air that we breathe, the water we drink, and the materials we harvest from nature in order to do that work. So once again, the economy is the sum total of our work. Now, here's the thing. We don't work with our bare hands, okay? We work with tools. Nobody works with bare hands. And we learned very early in our history as a species that if you work with your bare hands, you're going to get eaten, okay? You're not going to survive. And using tools, in fact, makes us more productive. And it is our capacity to work with tools and to work with tools collectively with each other, to cooperate in that work that makes us human. And that explains why we have gone from a few isolated clans that came down from the trees somewhere in East Africa to 7 billion and some people who have completely reshaped our planet for better and for worse. Our ability to use tools explains that power and that evolutionary success so far. Humans aren't unique in using tools. There are many animals that do this, of course. Chimpanzees use hollow sticks to get termites out of logs. Birds build nests. The great Canadian symbol, the beaver, is a great tool maker, building dams and homes in order to support their work, gathering fish and other food from their aquatic surroundings. So humans are not unique, but obviously our capacity to think about the tools that we use, learn how to use them better, and manipulate the materials in our environment is uniquely powerful. The use of those tools allows us to be more productive. We can produce more goods and services. They also allow us to produce different goods and services, better goods and services that you couldn't even imagine without the tools to do them. In fact, sometimes when we invent a tool, we then invent things to do with the tool. We invent whole new industries or activities. A good example is, of course, our smartphones. Until we knew that smartphones had the potential that they have as a tool, there was no industry to build apps for smartphones. And now there is. And it's an industry that employs hundreds of thousands of people because they've figured out new ways to use the tools that we have invented. A growing capacity of humans to use tools and to learn by doing, to think about how to do our jobs better, and to incrementally improve both the knowledge about how to do it and the tools that we do it with, has been critical to economic development. In fact, it is the dominant force in economic development. Through all of the systems that we covered, from hunter-gatherers to slavery to feudalism to capitalism to whatever comes next, the fundamental driving force is our ability to think about our work and how to do it better, including through the use of tools. So I mentioned nobody works with their bare hands. Not even a massage therapist does not work just with their bare hands, okay? Because the reality is you have to have a table for the person to lie on. You have to have a towel, to modestly cover their butt. And you got to have massage oil, otherwise it doesn't feel very good. And you've got to have, of course, some kind of sound system to play New Age yoga music in the background while you're getting your massage. This is the closest you come to working with your bare hands. And even this isn't just your bare hands. Every single job uses tools that we have learned to and utilize and to make our work better. And most jobs use much more complicated and expensive and advanced tools than that. So the question is, where did tools come from? Did tools fall from the sky and just happen to land up in somebody's private portfolio? Of course not. Tools are produced like everything else. The economy is the sum total of our work, and some of the work that we do goes into producing tools. Why? Well, we produce the tool in order to use it to produce something else. That's the whole point. So in economic terms, this is called an intermediate product. An intermediate good is something that we did, that we made, not for its own sake, okay, but in order to use, in order to produce something else. Instead of, it's not consumed in the final sense. It's not the inherent point. It's a kind of a roundabout way. Now, I know for some of us, especially some of the male persuasion, we're so obsessed with tools, we think they have value in their own right. We'll go to Canadian Tire and just walk around the hardware department and just, we're agog at those tools and think, man, those are great. And we somehow do get intrinsic pleasure from the tools themselves. But that's a bit strange. And economic purposes, the tools are not the end goal. The tools are a means to an end. So think about something like a tractor, okay? Our agricultural industry is enormously, hundreds of times more productive than it was when we first started farming. And the reason is because we've learned about all kinds of different tools, including machinery like tractors, but also things like fertilizer and technology in terms of crop rotation systems and so on. All kinds of tools that allow us to do that work more efficiently. And the tractor itself didn't fall from the sky. Human beings had to make the tractor. So think of it as a two-stage process. First, we got some people to work on making a tractor, and then we got people to use the tractor to farm. And the fact that the farming with the tractor is hundreds of times more productive than using a hand hoe or an oxen-pulled equipment means that the total amount of work that goes into farming is way, way, way lower, even when we count the intermediate work to produce the tractor. And this is what's allowed our economy to produce more than enough food for everyone in our society. In fact, we produce more than enough for everyone on the planet. Hunger in the planet is not the result of a shortage of food. It's about poverty and inequality. We produce more than enough food with a tiny fraction of our total labor force. So tools are things that we use to produce something else, and they are produced by us. So if we think of work as a two-stage process, first we produce the tool, then we use the tool to do the end task. The crucial thing, work was the driving force in both of those stages. Work was the driving force that produced the tool, and then work was the driving force that used the tool to do other work. And the tools themselves do nothing. Okay, I don't know if you've noticed, but if you wander around Canadian Tire, like I was just describing, and look at all the tools on the shelf, they aren't producing anything. They aren't productive. It's only when a human being takes them and uses them. And this is really important in understanding capitalism because just owning a tool does not mean you're doing something productive. You have status, you have power, you probably have income and wealth, but there's nothing you did by owning it. The ownership is a social relationship, not a productive economic act. The productivity was the people who produced the tool and the people who used the tool. So we've summed it up with this cartoon from our book by my wonderful illustrator, Tony Biddle. There's the owner of the company. This machinery is very productive, and I own it. That's why I'm rich. And then there's the workers. Wait a minute, buddy. You didn't build this machinery. You don't operate it. In fact, it's hard to see what you actually do around here. It depends. If he was a hands-on owner of the company and actually managed stuff, then maybe he could say that he was doing work. At this stage, he's just helping to hold up that counter there. So the ownership itself is a social status, not a productive act. The point of that whole discussion was to demystify what we mean when we talk about capital, because capital sounds very important. It sounds very, meaningful. It sounds very expensive. It sounds very complicated. In fact, there's nothing complicated about it all. Capital is an economic term that refers in aggregate to the tools that we use in our work. And that can be fixed structures, it can be buildings, it can be offices and shops, it can be railroads, it can be pipelines, it can be electric wires, it can be hand tools that we wield, it can be robots, it can be assembly lines, it can even be intangible tools. Even things like computer code or pharmaceutical formula are things that we worked on. They took human work to get that, and we use them to produce something else. And so that's often called intellectual capital or intangible capital. But it's all things that were produced by human endeavor and that we use to produce something else. So in the physical sense, we're thinking of those tangible products, the machinery, equipment, structures, and we can also include the intangible things. We are not, in this meaning, talking about money. Okay, money is something different, and we're going to talk about money and how businesses use money. In fact, how businesses create money, which is going to be fun when we get to that section. But in the economic sense, in the pure economic sense, we're talking about the actual machinery. It could be structures, it could be the machinery and equipment, it could be infrastructure. You also have a certain amount of intermediate products that are tied up in raw materials or things that are partly made but not fully made. Your inventory, the other things that you keep on hand. And then also those intangible assets that I talked about as well. So just before I move on, I'm just going to come back to that and say, when we talk about capital, we're talking about tools in a physical sense, when we talk about physical capital. So as the system of capitalism, where capital plays a particular structural role, means something about the tools, okay? Something about how we organize tools and how we control tools and how we own tools. That's at the core of how our economic system works. Because remember, one of the defining features of capitalism, most production is undertaken by private for-profit firms. And in order to undertake production, they have to have tools. And the ownership of those tools vested in the companies that are undertaking production in order to make a profit is a key structural feature of how our economy works. So let's talk about those private companies that undertake the majority of production. As we talked about, 85% in a largely market-oriented economy like Canada's. The private company is the entity through which that for-profit production is organized and undertaken. So what we mean here is that most of the work that makes up our economy is organized through private companies that initiate production, that get everything organized, that order the raw materials and supplies and inputs, that purchase the real capital, the real tools that are required to do the job, and then sell the product and hope to get a profit at the end of the day. So private companies come in all shapes and sizes and structures, from the huge to the tiny. And the ones that get the biggest headlines and in a way have the biggest reach and the biggest influence, of course, are very large companies, corporations that have global reach, that can push buttons and manage supply chains and sell their product all over the world. In large corporations, of course, the vast majority of people are paid employees. Most of the work that goes on are wage laborers of different kinds. And remember, that was the other defining feature of capitalism, that most of the work undertaken in the formal economy are people doing it for someone else under their direction in return for a wage or salary. And in a large corporation, that's just about everyone. There are a few owners who also work in large corporations, the CEO, and maybe the top handful of other executives always own significant shares of the corporation. So they are owners and top managers. But most of the people in a corporation can be described as wage laborers of different kinds. Then you have medium-sized firms. The typical definition for medium enterprise in Canada is something between 20 and 500 employees, not a gigantic earth-moving corporation, but still a significant one. And like a corporation, an organization in which most of the work is done by wage labor, paid workers who are employed to do what the boss wants them to do. So the difference between a corporation and a medium-sized firm generally is just a matter of scale. Then you have very small firms, and the vast majority of businesses are very small firms. In Canada, there are 2 million registered businesses in Canada, and 98% of them are tiny. That doesn't mean that small business dominates the economy. Far from it. It just means there's an awful lot of very small companies. A very small firm could be as little as one person who got a corporate status and set up a business and hung their shingle out, and ranging to just a handful of people. In those small firms, most of the work may not be done by wage labor. And this is a qualitative difference between those very small businesses, micro businesses, perhaps you could call them, and the medium-sized or larger corporations. In very small businesses, like a corner store, say, most of the work is done by the owner and their family. My mother grew up in a family like that, a family that owned a small corner store, and they had a couple of wage employees, but most of the work was done by her father and her mother, not paid for it in cash, of course, and the kids. And there's still a lot of firms that depend on the unpaid labor of family members in order to survive. So this is qualitatively different because the role of wage labor in these very small firms can be quite smaller than in other private businesses. Regardless of the size and regardless of the precise structure, and we'll talk a little bit more about different ways that companies are organized, the key things that they all have in common: somebody owns them. Okay, they're private companies, somebody owns them. Who owns them? It ranges, and we'll talk about different ways that they're owned, but somebody owns them. And whoever owns the company owns the profits that the company gets and generates. So this is key. Then there's a question of control. It's not just ownership, it's who tells the company what to do. And ultimately, the owners of a company, even a large corporation where the owners may be quite dispersed across people who own different shares of the company, even there, you've had the development of very powerful systems to ensure that the owners are directing the company and telling it what to do. The company is not an entity in its own right. The company doesn't have a mind of its own. The company is the institution through which the owners of the company undertakes economic activity and tries to make a profit. These things are in common to all private companies, regardless of their size. Let's talk about some of the variety, again, diversity in the way that companies can be organized. The simplest ones are just a straight up individual proprietorship. And that accounts for, again, most of those 2 million companies that are registered in Canada. The individual owner runs it, they own it, they control it directly, and in many cases, they're the one who does the work. So no issue about, how do the owners make sure the company does what they want. The owner does. You could have, as you pull people together and their talent and their energy and their money to invest in the company, you could get to a partnership type of arrangement where 2 or more small business owners get together and set up a joint company so that they can share the work and share the risk and share the profit. More complicated still, of course, is when you get into an actual corporate status. The interesting thing about corporations is it's a way of establishing a legal shield, if you like, between a company and its owners. You often see still the abbreviation LTD period CO period, limited company, or sometimes the other way around, company limited. And that is a reference to the limited liability that the corporation has. If you establish a corporate status, and that means you have to go and get registered and create a legal entity and governance documents and pay corporate taxes, et cetera, what you're doing is you're creating a separate legal personality, in essence, for the business to keep it a little bit separate from your personality as a human being. And the idea there is to limit the risk that the owners face if the company goes under, goes bankrupt, screws up, gets sued for a huge amount of money. If it's a limited liability company, okay, the company can be sued, the company can lose all of its assets, but they can't come after you as the individual, and they can't come after your assets above and beyond what you already invested in the company itself. So you can see why this is a handy invention. The invention of the corporation is a very convenient way for the owners of companies, capitalists, to limit their exposure. It allows them to, first of all, invest in a number of different companies all at the same time rather than having their eggs in one basket. And it means that their own wealth and their own house and their own personal accumulation is not in jeopardy if the whole company goes under, beyond what they chose to invest in the company itself. If you know, whatever you poured into the company and the actual investment in the company, in shares, if it's a huge corporation, or in direct capital, if it's a smaller corporation, is at risk for sure if the company fails. The rest of your wealth is fine. So that's why you can see, you know, tycoons who went down in history as heading up infamous, often scandalous, often criminal enterprises that went broke. You know, Bre-X Minerals and Nortel Networks and other companies like that. The people who are in charge are still drinking fine plonk and living in a very nice house somewhere, thanks to the magic of the limited liability corporation. There's two great movies by a Canadian director, Joel Bacan, called The Corporation, and then a new one, The Corporation, the sequel. And these are great documentaries. I highly recommend them to look at the history of the corporate form, where it came from, and the function that it portrays, and the incredibly scandalous, unethical things that are legitimated because of the creation of a separate personality for these businesses. Now, in addition to the benefits of creating that corporate status, that could still be one person. You can do that as just an individual. You can have a proprietorship that is incorporated in the sense that you've created that separate business and then you're limiting your risks. But what has also been facilitated through this structure is what's called joint stock corporations. And these are bigger companies where the ownership has been spread across a large number of people who own little bits of the company. And this is where what's known as equity shares or stocks come from, where a corporation is established with its own separate personality under the law. And then the ownership of the corporation is divided up into little pieces called a share. And if you've ever seen a share certificate, you know, if you happen to have some shares maybe in your own safety deposit box, or you've seen somebody who has it, it lists the company. It's always on fancy paper, and it shows that you own one share in the company. Now, a large company will have hundreds of millions of shares. So, you know, I'm sure you're proud that you can hold up the share and say, look, I'm a capitalist too, okay? But the reality is you've got a tiny piece of that action, and many benefits to the business class of this arrangement. It is a way of helping spread out the cost and risk of getting a company going in the first place by drawing on investments, smaller investments made by larger numbers of individual owners. From the owner's perspective, it really allows you to diversify your wealth because you don't have to tie up your whole future with one particular company. You can take a little piece of the action in many different companies. Also, because the shares are smaller, they're generally easier to sell. So if you decide you want to get out of that business, it's easier to find someone to buy a few shares than if you have the whole company. Then you got to find someone who wants to buy the whole company. That's actually a problem for a lot of small and medium enterprises that aren't in a joint stock type of arrangement. When the entrepreneur gets to retirement age and they want to get out of it, they might have someone in their family who wants to take it over, or they might not. In which case, they have to go and find somebody who wants to buy, an entire dry cleaning business or some other business, and that's a hard thing to do. So the shares, by dividing them up into small pieces, allows more buying and selling and trading of the ownership. And that has allowed these companies, again, to become very large, much larger in most cases than could be owned by one individual. Although we have been reminded in recent years, one individual can own an awful lot of wealth. So, Jeff Bezos still owns about 10% of Amazon, the fifth largest corporation in the world. So, and the same goes for some of the other ultra rich people that we see. So, it isn't impossible to have the ownership very concentrated in an individual, but it's not necessarily the most convenient, particularly for those who want to buy and sell shares of those companies over time. Thanks to the corporate status and the evolution of joint stock systems, you've now got companies that are more enormous than we ever could have thought of in history. In fact, they're becoming more and more and more enormous. There's been a process of concentration in very large companies, including in the tech sector. We have a situation now where the major U.S. stock market, the New York Stock Exchange and the S&P 500 index, which is considered the broader index of the stock market in the U.S., 20 to 25%, depending what day of the week it is, 20 to 25% of the value of that entire stock market wrapped up with five companies, the five big tech giants, which is Amazon, Microsoft, Google, Apple, and I always forget the fifth one. Somebody throw it in fangs. Facebook, that's the fifth one. Why do I forget Facebook? Because it's an utterly useless invention. That's why. Okay. Anyways, the corporate status and the joint stock system means these things are enormous. In fact, they're bigger than countries. Now, here are some different comparisons. This comes from the textbook, and this is, the textbook was 2015, so this is a little bit out of date now. The comparisons would be even more stunning, particularly in regards to the tech companies that I just mentioned. At that point, a company like ExxonMobil produced more GDP than a country like Finland, which is a medium-sized advanced country. Walmart employed more people than New Zealand, a smallish country, but employing that many people in one company, astounding. Apple, at that point, had more cash on hand than the U.S. federal government, which starts to make you understand how the world works, doesn't it? And that'll be far worse now because Apple's worth a whole lot more now than it was in 2013. So these enormous private companies have become larger and more powerful and in a way more flexible. Their reach goes all over the world. And these are the companies that really do direct the trajectory of the overall economy with their decisions. Small and medium-sized companies are important in the grand scheme of things, but in most cases, they depend on those bigger companies to be sort of setting the pace and deciding what's happening. And most small and medium enterprises end up selling some of their output to bigger companies, or they depend on consumer spending from people who are employed in big companies. So the role of these giant corporations in our economy is enormous. Who owns them? This is a really important question because there's a huge mythology out there about how corporations are owned and how we all can participate in this wonderful initiative called capitalism. Particularly with the larger joint stock companies, you've got ownership that's dispersed among hundreds of thousands of different shareholders who might own, as few as one share, or, in some cases, you can't even own one share. This financial trading company, Berkshire Hathaway, that Warren Buffett, the legendary capitalist in America, is the leader and major owner of. Their shares, because they decided that almost quaintly they didn't want to split their shares as the company got worth more. Their shares are worth hundreds of thousands of dollars for one share. So you might think you're making a big investment just to get one share. Same goes, for Amazon and Apple and other companies that expanded their value. At any rate, you can buy and sell those shares on the stock market from anywhere from hundreds of thousands of dollars for Berkshire Hathaway to pennies for shares in some smaller and more speculative companies. This creates an issue. You've got thousands or hundreds of thousands of people who are the owners of the company. How do you make sure that the company acts in the owner's interest? It's much more complicated than with a proprietorship or a partnership where the owners are clear and can get together and say, this is what we want the company to do. The way that they've structured and solved this problem, and it has been solved, there's no doubt about it. Once upon a time, decades ago, people used to think that corporations were out of control, that they'd become their own empires and were acting in ways that didn't ultimately benefit their owners. And that is no longer the case. There is no doubt that corporations act ruthlessly and quickly and immediately in order to maximize the wealth of the people who own it. And the way they did this was through corporate governance structures by which shareholders exert control over a company through governance structures, including annual general meetings and electing boards of directors, but especially through the way that the top managers of corporations are compensated. And that is, they are all major owners themselves. The way to solve the potential problem of a divergence of interest between the managers of a company and its owners is to ensure that they're one and the same. So top managers are always owners. They're expected to make personal investments in the company, but beyond that, they receive much of their compensation in things that are tied to equity, either outright shares or stock options, which allow them to purchase shares on favorable terms and give them a huge incentive to try and boost the share price of the companies that they're managing. So in this regard, there is no doubt the corporations act as ruthlessly and focused on maximizing profit and, even more importantly, wealth, the market wealth of the company, as if it was just one person doing it. Moreover, even though the company may have hundreds of thousands of different owners in the form of those little shares, the evidence is overwhelming that the majority, a controlling interest in the whole system, is still owned by a surprisingly small elite, basically, a surprisingly small and very wealthy segment of society. And in this regard, we have to dig below the rhetoric about how we're all playing the market. It's a shareholder economy, through our mutual funds, through our pension funds, through other vehicles. We all focus on the market. That is largely a kind of ideological and self-serving construct. The thing there is that the financial system that created this, and again, we'll get more into finance in a later session, and the people who own the system, in a way, want us to all think like owners, in large part because they want us to go along with the sorts of policy recommendations that they put in place, things that benefit companies and the people who own them. And if you've got a couple of shares in the Royal Bank or a couple of shares in Bell Canada, I in no way want to undermine your sense of self-worth, but you are not a big wheel capitalist, okay? You have a trivial and ultimately insignificant slice of the action. The reality is that the controlling interest in business wealth in our economy is concentrated in about 2% of the population. This is a slide we put up before about defining the capitalist class in today's terms. In the Industrial Revolution, the soot-encased cities of Britain in the 1800s, it was easy to spot the capitalist. He was the guy in the top hat, and the corner office who lived in a mansion on the hill so he didn't have to breathe in the smoke. Nowadays, it's harder to spot the capitalists, but the capitalists are still there. And as we discussed last week, in my approach, I have defined the group of people in society who own enough wealth that they don't have to work. Some of them do, but they don't have to. They can live very well without working. That group owns the controlling interest in private business wealth. And there's a large overlap between that group and the people who are the top managers of businesses, either because you're an owner and a manager, if you're an owner of a medium-sized company, or because you're a top manager who's in a corporation who's expected to be an owner of the corporation as well. And so that's why I prefer the sort of more descriptive and less pejorative term, instead of calling them, the running dog lackeys of the bourgeoisie or whatever, like some people might have said in the past. I call them, hopefully more neutrally, the major owners and top managers of private businesses. And the reality is that the ownership of that private business sector is surprisingly narrow. So this is some data that's in the textbook again about the breakdown of ownership of financial wealth across major industrial countries and in the world as a whole. And it is shocking, the divergence between this reality of incredible concentration at the top end of society and the mythology that capitalism is somehow a participant sport and that we're all part of the markets. So in Canada's case, the richest 10% of the population own close to 60% of all business wealth. The concentration of wealth, by the way, is much, much worse than inequality in income. Okay, income is, what you earn in the course of a year. Wealth is what you have, what you own. And the reality is that wealth is far less equally distributed than income. Income is badly distributed. We've got terrible income inequality. The richest 10% of the population in Canada would get about 25% of income every year before tax. But wealth is much, much more concentrated. We don't have precise breakdowns in Canada. One of the reasons it's hard to get data on this is because we don't collect good statistics on financial wealth. And when I define financial wealth, I'm not counting your residence, okay? I'm not counting the fact that if you live in Toronto or Vancouver, you're a millionaire because your house cost $1 million. Far from it. So I'm talking about financial wealth that you can do things with. And so much wealth is concentrated in a small number of households. If you just did a survey, there's no way, that Lord Thompson, the richest man in Canada, would happen to be captured by your random survey. You would never capture the amount of wealth in those that small group of households. So you have to use other sources of data. Income tax data is one where there's some interesting things. Income tax doesn't report wealth, but you can impute it on the basis of forms of income that are tied to wealth, things like dividends and capital gains and so on. There's other ways that people have tried to gather data on wealth, but we don't have a precise picture. But about 30% of all business wealth in Canada is owned by the richest 1%. And then throw in the next percent. This is how I got to 2% instead of 1% at the top, and 98% instead of 99% at the bottom. This is the controlling interest. You don't have to own more than 50% of a company. Most people understand this in order to control it. You can be a controlling shareholder with a concerted group of shares that's less than that. Look at this. And in the year we did this, there were 54 billionaires in Canada. And together they owned 5% of all business wealth. So 54 people, way less than are online right now in this class, own 5% of the entire country's business wealth. Compare that to what the bottom 50%, so that's like 18 million, owned 3% of financial wealth. Most people have almost no financial wealth. Most people have no significant disposable financial wealth. They may own some equity in their home. They may have a few $100 in their checking account, but most people don't have significant stores of wealth. And across the whole bottom half of the population, there's less wealth than in that group of 54 billionaires. And that pattern that the billionaires own more than the bottom half of the population is clear across all of those countries and indeed in the world as a whole. So it sounds old-fashioned to talk about a small elite owning the business system, but that is the reality, and it's tricky to see it, but it's, I think, very clear and very concerning. A handful of billionaires have more control over the whole business system than most people. Let's talk about this whole idea of companies and their quest for profit. Competition forces companies to meet the going rate of profit or else go out of business. We have a system where companies compete with each other, and that imposes a certain discipline and a certain logic on the whole system. And I think sometimes we tend to, some of us anyways, from my world on the left of the spectrum, tend to portray capitalists and the companies they own as, evil and amoral, and in some cases they are. But in most cases, they're just trying to survive and get by in a system that requires them to act in certain ways, or else someone else will come along and do it for them. And this fact that competition forces businesses to act in certain ways, including ways that are damaging to society by, downsizing workers and laying them off, or damaging to the environment through pollution. We can point to them and say, you shouldn't do that, and they shouldn't. But at the same time, we got to say, why are they doing that? They're doing that because we are in an economy where private companies are competing with each other to increase their share of the overall market so that their profits can be bigger. And if you just stood back from that and say, I don't want to be that aggressive, I just want to carry on with a comfortable, more easygoing business, someone else will come along and say, no, I can do it better, and I'll drive you out of business. So this production for profit in the context of competition creates a certain logic that drives companies to do things that are not useful or maybe harmful. Sometimes they're helpful. Some of the ideas are good and productive and enhance our standard of living, but not all of them. They do it because it's profitable. And we can never assume that just because something is profitable, that means it's good. And hence, our economy organized around private companies producing for profit means we might be missing the plot at certain times. So on that note, I am going to just, first I'll show this little cartoon. Here's the board of directors. They've had a special retreat to develop their corporate mission statement. Everyone has to have a corporate mission statement. And theirs is to make money, wads of it, and pay as little income tax as possible. And no matter what corporations say on their mission statement and all the highfalutin language that's in there, this is their mission statement. So I'm going to just give you a moment here to jump into the Q&A here, because this difference between doing something that's useful and doing something that's profitable is very interesting when you think about it. And I want to see if you've got some ideas. Not everything that happens in our economy is useful or constructive or productive or enhances our well-being. And some of it undermines our well-being. So think of something that in your life, in your experience in the economy, that is profitable, that a company does that is profitable, but is not useful, okay? And it could be useless or it could be outright harmful, but they're doing it because it's profitable. And put that example in the Q&A, and we'll have a bit of a scan of some of the answers that we get back. As you're thinking about that and typing it out, I'm going to give you one example. The telephone soliciting industry. Okay. Now, I know we've got anti-spam laws in Canada now, so we don't get as many of these calls as we used to, but we still get them. And they invariably come at dinner time, where somebody phones you and tries to sell you something that you have no interest in whatsoever. And it's not just useless, it's harmful. It's interrupted your dinner. It probably wasted a bit of your time. I hope you weren't rude to the person phoning. I never like that, because they're just doing a job, and they're doing a lousy job because they're desperate. But politely say, I'm not interested, thank you very much. And hope that you didn't get indigestion because your dinner was interrupted. So this is something that's useless. It has very, very low rates of positive response. But because of technology and globalization, they can hire people to do this for pennies an hour from India or Philippines or somewhere else to interrupt your dinner to try to sell you something that you're not interested in. That's profitable. Okay, it happens because it's profitable, and there's businesses that make big money off of that. It's useless. It's incredibly unproductive. It's a waste of their time, and it's a waste of your time. So that's just one example. Okay, I am going to just take a peek here and see if we got any other good suggestions. Please repeat the name of the documentary filmmaker. This isn't in response to this request. Oh, somebody's already put it in the Q&A. It's Joel Bakan, Bakan. And the documentary is called The Corporation. I'm going down gaming. Okay, gaming, casinos, very profitable. Are they useful? Some people would say they're entertainment, but that's not what most people are there for. So I agree. Bottled water. There's a great one. The water out of the tap here in Canada, because we at least have in most parts of Canada, not everywhere, including First Nations communities. In most parts of Canada, the water out of the tap is better. We don't need bottles. It's totally wasteful and totally useless. products that emit carbon. Junk food, okay, good one. Computer games, well, there'd be a debate about that. Some people would say they're genuinely beneficial. The oil industry and its spills, gaming websites and casinos, the weapons industry, there's one that's designed to be destructive, and it's very profitable, of course. Buying and selling stocks as a way of making your living, quite right, and we'll get into this in our section on the financial system. Treating housing as an investment, not an essential public good. Unhealthy sugar and fat-laden foods, tricking consumers to buy something that doesn't actually help them, like non-GMO food. Good point. Tar sands oil extraction, very profitable, very damaging. Anyways, those are great answers. Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, now let's see if I can carry on. We'll take a few more minutes before our break and just talk about what is profit, how do we define it, and how do we track it. In an economic sense, it is a surplus. We talked about surplus in the economy earlier in the second section on economic history that we talked about. And in an economic sense, it means something that's left over after you've done what was needed to sort of stay alive and keep the thing going. So the costs of reproduction, if you like, the costs of starting over again, in terms of supporting the workers to be able to live and continue to work, and also accounting for and paying off the wear and tear on any machinery or tools that you used, is a surplus. And this is also true in an accounting sense, not in an economic sense. In an accounting sense, you get to profit by taking all of the revenues in a company and then deducting the costs, and then the profit is what's left over. So it is a surplus. And this is a convenient way to think of it. And if you recall from our history talk, we looked at the different forms of economic activity that we've had over history and saw that not in the hunting-gathering society where no surplus existed really, and there was a very flat social structure. But from that point on, every society has had a surplus. It's produced more than was required just to keep everyone alive. And the issue of who controls the surplus and what they do with it is a vital feature of how the economy is organized and how it operates. So how do you measure profit? Well, this is a very simple introduction to it, but I think this will be pretty intuitive to most people. You take all the money that one of those private companies, whatever size it was, generated, and you start deducting things. The first thing you deduct are the immediate operating expenses, the wages, the raw materials, the rent, etc., that you had to do to produce that. And that leaves you with something that's often called operating profit, which is just a measure of the kind of inherent profitability of the company. But that's not enough. You've got to account for other things that the business is doing or not doing, including depreciation, which is the wear and tear on capital, interest costs that you might be paying on money that you borrowed, any other overhead, management, marketing, etc. costs in order to get something that's a closer depiction of the true surplus created by the business. If you haven't got well-paid accountants who allowed you to avoid all your corporate income tax by sheltering your money in Turks and Caicos Islands, then you have to deduct something for corporate income tax, and then you're left with what is commonly called net income, the net income or profit, after-tax profit of a business. And then there's lots of ways that you can look at a company and its profitability and determine how well it's doing. Different, if you study finance at all or follow the business pages, there's different ways that investors and analysts evaluate companies and see how well they're doing. The operating margin is just looking at operating profit as a share of total revenue, and it's just kind of a first glimpse of how good or bad things are doing. There's an old joke that the company might be losing money on each unit, but they're going to make up for it with volume. Okay, which is if your operating margin is negative, it doesn't help to be producing more. You actually end up losing more money. EBITDA or return on capital, return on equity are also other ways of measuring and evaluating. One that isn't common in the commercial financial industry, but that I'm interested in as an economist, is what we would look at the total surplus that's generated on capital in a business, which would include the interest payments. Interest is still going to somebody who owns capital, but it's not going to a shareholder or owner of the company itself. It's going to some financial interest that lent the company money. So usually interest is deducted before you calculate profit as a return to the owners. But in a economic sense, I sometimes like to lump it in with profit and look at the total return to capital, both the share capital of the business and the financial capital or the banks who lent it some money.